Mandell Crawley, sir, it is such a pleasure to see you this morning. And I have been so excited to have you on the Investing in Integrity podcast. Have so many questions today. I know so many people in our audience and in our community have been thrilled about you coming on the podcast. First, I just want to ask, how are you and where are you calling in from today?
Well, thank you, Ross. It's so good to be here with you. Thanks for having me, and to the community that's listening to this. It's just a privilege to be with you all. I am here in my home office in New Rochelle, New York, which is about 20 miles north of Manhattan.
Fabulous, fabulous. I love the artwork in the background. Who's the boxer on the wall behind
Oh,
you?
there's only one that gets on this wall, and it's the greatest. So I'll leave it at that. It's the greatest.
I was going to say Floyd Merriweather would say it's him, but
No, no, no. I didn't say money. I didn't say money Mayweather. I said the greatest, which
the
is one guy.
greatest, the greatest. Ali, I love it. I love it.
Indeed.
Well, Mandel, I'm super excited to have you today. I want to dive right in because we don't have a lot of time. And I know you and I could do 10 episodes together. There's so much to talk about. I'd love to start off our conversation with your story. You have an incredibly unique story, in my opinion. Can you just begin by sharing with all of our listeners the journey that you went through to get to where you are today?
Yeah, by definition, we all have a unique, journey narrative, and mine is no different in that. Far from this elegant linear progression through a now 3 decade career in finance. I'm a kid from Chicago, one of three boys. Shout out to all the middle kids out there who may be listening to it. The struggle is real when you're the middle child. My parents were high school sweethearts. Sadly, my brothers and I, we lost our parents, relatively early in life. And as a result, we experienced a lot of trauma early on, but our grandparents, specifically my maternal grandparents, stepped in, filled the gap, and became mom and dad for us. And look, we had what I would consider to be a relatively normal upbringing. Growing up on Chicago's West Side, inner city, but it was normal for us. There's a lot of structural headwinds that have hampered a number of our large urban communities for some time, and we know what the drivers of those things have been. But through what I call this three-pillar strategy, church was the opposite of optional. My grandparents' Christian faith was ever present in our home. The Boys and Girls Club, which is an organization I am privileged to be on the board of to this day, played a critical role in saving our lives, if you will, and of course, education. My grandparents weren't particularly well educated in a formal context, being from rural Mississippi, but it was the opposite of optional in our household. So, and that led me to an internship. So I was 17 years old. I didn't have a tremendous amount of exposure to the world of finance. Frankly, I had every intent on being an educator. I thought I'd be a teacher, an incredibly noble profession. And there were so many women in my community that were educators or what have you. And I started this internship at Dean Witter, which is a predecessor firm, that's now part of Morgan Stanley. Working $5 an hour, 20 hours, making $5 an hour, working 20 hours a week, supporting bond traders. And so that's how it began. And I won't bore the audience with all the things that I've done across our ecosystem over the last 30 years. But it was a classic example of where you have someone who maybe has a measure of talent, getting access to an opportunity that left to my own devices, I probably wouldn't have had access to, but getting access to this opportunity opened the world up to me, and I've enjoyed it. I've had a tremendous amount of optionality, career optionality, and experiences since that time. So,
I would say I don't think that the audience would be bored by hearing the vast array of roles that you've played in your ascent at Morgan Stanley. I think it's incredibly interesting that you started at 17. You've been there your entire career since. Um, can you give us like 60 seconds on just the quick career progression you had through Morgan Stanley?
Yeah, so I started in sales and trading. I was a small public finance sales and trading operation. So I spent my first 7 years on the small team in Chicago, which the environment I can't speak highly. I can't overstate how helpful that was for me in the development in the early years. I moved to New York in 1999 as this 24-year-old kid and never left the city of Chicago. And I joined a bigger sales and trading operation at the World Trade Center, obviously in the heart of finance. So 14 years at Morgan Stanley was in sales and trading in fixed income. I was the national sales manager for the fixed income distribution team. And then I moved to our broader wealth management business, and I was the national sales manager for our wealth management business, which is part of, is one of the crown jewels, if you will, inside Morgan Stanley right now. Then I had the good fortune of becoming our chief marketing officer. This was like 2014 to 2017, and sort of having the responsibility to nurture and care for, the world-class brand that is Morgan Stanley, the name on the front of the jersey, if you will. And that stretched me a lot because I'm not particularly creative, but, I learned a lot in that. With that remit. And then, the dream job for me, candidly, was running our private wealth management business, which is essentially working with ultra high net worth families to optimize their financial, family, and social capital. Incredibly intellectually stimulating, and you have to have a high degree of competitive urgency in being in that business. You're competing against the Goldmans, the JPs, the Rockefellers of the world, and telling the Morgan Stanley story and giving the why. So I enjoyed that. And then lastly, late in 2020, our CEO asked me to take on a completely different remit and become the chief people officer for Morgan Stanley, to which I struggle with, Ross, to be candid. Being in the business, the private wealth business, sort of sits at the center of the Morgan Stanley ecosystem, and to step out of that. And I didn't have a great enough appreciation, at least at the time, for the people and culture crisis that we were about to, frankly, that we were in the throes of, with COVID happening and then so many other things happening on the social justice front. And so while I don't have the technical chops of running payroll operations and some of the other technical aspects of a human capital function, people and culture, which I know, the scholars of finance is all about this in many respects, I get really jazzed about. And here we are 1 year in. I've learned a ton, and I'm definitely a better athlete for having taken on, this assignment.
It sounds like an absolutely incredible journey, from CMO on private wealth now, chief people officer, as you said, as CHRO at Morgan Stanley. I'm really curious, a lot of our listeners, you have a lot of students listening, you have a lot of early career professionals in IB, PE, asset management. A lot of our listeners are advisors. They're very, very senior executives, past guests on the show, who are still trying to sharpen their craft and their career. All the roles that you've had, they're very different. You called yourself an athlete. And I think your resume and your background clearly indicate that you are. Could you share a little bit more about your decision-making process as you decided to make some of those moves? Like even when you were asked to become chief people officer, CHRO, what was the calculus you went through in that and other career shifts?
Yeah, like I think if I oversimplify it, Ross, you've got generalists, in terms of talent types. You've got, folks who've got a level of versatility and dexterity where they can do a number of different things, right? Just give them a measure of time to learn the craft, and then ultimately they'll be able to, add alpha, if you will, as it relates to whatever that remit is. And then you've got the specialists who can go 3-4 derivatives deep in a particular, vertical. And candidly, in organizations of all shapes and sizes, you need both. I have been, to state the obvious, the generalist, if you will. And for me, and this isn't something that I've always known, right? But as I've gotten older and as I've come to these proverbial forks in the road, I've developed a framework. And frankly, part of this I lifted from the great Jim Collins. I listened to him on on YouTube once, and he described, three concentric circles, right, as it relates to optimizing one's talents, if you will. So there's three things that matter above all else. One is you want to be really interested in the work, right? You want to be really passionate about it, right? But passion on its own is not enough. The second circle, right, is it has to align to your superpowers, right? Or your particular slice of genius, if you will, right? And this is where you got to be really self-aware, and you have to truly understand what your core competency is. And then the third circle, which is critical, is you've got to be able to monetize it, right? And and what I mean by monetizing it is that it's got to be in a space that is growing, right? Sheryl Sandberg said in her first book, Lean In, that one of the most important factors of a successful career is you got to be proximate to growth. And I think she used metaphorically, you got to board the rocket ship. And I could not agree more. And so you want to be passionate about it. You want to make sure that it aligns to your signature strengths, and then you want to be able to monetize it. So that, to me, will help your listeners, right, as they're thinking about different opportunities to. So if you think about the world of possibilities, use this as your filter, right? And if you're honest, you'll find yourself at a space where you're now considering opportunities that align to not just what your interests are, but it's actually areas where you can have real impact. As that old adage goes, if you do what you love, right, or if you're working really hard at things that come natural to you, right, it won't feel that much like work. And I think that that's true. And the last thing I'll say, partner, is that there's 4 questions, right? And this will give your listeners a lens into when should I move? Right? Because that's the other part. Like I just gave you, like, if I'm going to move, what do I want to move to? But when should I move? There are 4 questions that matter. Am I learning? Am I growing? Am I having impact? Am I happy? Right? There's a lot of questions you can ask, but the 4 that really matter. Am I learning? Am I growing? Am I having impact? Am I happy? And if you can't say yes to all 4 of those things, it's probably time to think about doing something else.
Thanks. I appreciate it. How do you differentiate learning and growing? What's the distinction there?
So you could very much be learning something, right? Conceptually, we learn things every day, but not all learning is created equal, right? Not all learning is necessarily accretive to whatever your personal sort of growth agenda is, and that gets to whatever your career goals and aspirations ultimately are. So you can be in a job that's intellectually stimulating on some level, but it's not necessarily, stimulation that you'll be able to leverage because you're doing a job that doesn't align to your core strengths, right? So I guess in concept, if you want to be really practical about it, it's still accretive because you're learning, but you're not necessarily moving, right, in the direction, right, from a growth perspective, or it's not putting you in a position where you're putting more proverbial points on the board because you're learning a particular thing, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I appreciate you pulling in Jim Collins' hedgehog concept from Good to Great. We use that at SOF when we're hiring people, when we are staffing, when we're deciding who takes on what projects. One of my favorite frameworks. I want to shift us into another conversation. You were the former chief marketing officer, and one thing that you and I have talked a lot about is the reputation of finance and really the role of capital and capitalism, right, in advancing our society. I remember in some, we've had a number of phone calls now. I've been super, super grateful for our growing friendship and your mentorship. And one thing that you've explained to me is that when you were chief marketing officer, you were coming out of a pretty difficult time reputationally for the firm, and you really thought through what is the role that finance, that capital, that capitalism plays. What is the role that we play in advancing our society? And we've talked a lot about social capitalism or conscious capitalism. I would love to hear your perspective on, the role of capitalism, and really to hear your perspective on this notion of social capitalism or conscious capitalism, and how capitalism can go beyond the immediate profit, no matter what the consequences, to profitably solving problems and improving society.
Yeah, no, this is it's the exact right question, particularly given the spirit uh, of this great organization that you lead. And I just applaud you and your staff, and everyone, all the stakeholders of Scholars of Finance, because it's just hard um, to overstate how important the mission is, and how you guys are trying to scale that for and adding to the talent supply chain, which again I'm personally excited about. But God, I don't know how much time we have on this podcast because there's so much to unpack here in that question. But I will tell you, like anything, like most things, I should say, things can be weaponized for good or for evil. To be really blunt about it. And the challenge that we've historically had in our industry is, unfortunately, capital, in terms of folks who have access to it and how it's ultimately distributed, it's uneven. And it's beyond the scope of obviously what we're going to talk about here today, but clearly some of the output of the unevenness is the structural imbalances that we have in terms of income inequality, which I think is potentially a powder keg, not just in this country but globally. I mean, it is a real issue, is a real problem. So that's in many respects sort of the downside, if you will, of capital, because while as a competitive matter we all believe that if you work really hard, you can be great. Malcolm Gladwell, you 10,000 hours, you put in the work, you burn the calories, the output is on balance going to be a positive thing. Or we tell you feed a man a fish. You feed him for a day, but if you teach him to fish, you could. But in order to do that, I think it was Trevor Noah that said, "Yeah, but I at least need a fishing rod so that I can actually learn to actually fish." So there are clearly some things that we can talk about in terms of the challenges. But I think in terms of using finance as a force for good, and that's why I love this organization and what you all are trying to do, is this idea, as you mentioned, going back to my marketing days. Morgan Stanley, we advise, originate, trade, manage, and distribute capital. We do it for governments, we do it for institutions, and we do it for individuals, and we try to do it with a standard of excellence. And in telling our story to the marketplace, instead of talking about Morgan Stanley proper, we decided to tell stories of clients, right, who are doing incredible things to enhance our society. And to me, it's an example of this thing that we all know, that to have innovation and to enhance our standard of living, it's not enough to just have really good ideas, right? It's not sufficient to say innovation is just all about ideas. It starts there. But in order to scale the idea, right, to the point where it actually makes its way through our social ecosystem, to where it actually enhances our lives. So if you take Netflix, Apple, Amazon, pick any brand that resonates with you, in order for that idea, right, to scale and ultimately have the impact that it's ultimately had, you've needed capital to do that. And one of the things that I'm excited about in terms of just where the world is, and clearly the ESG framework, in my view, those three letters will be the theme easily for the next 25 years in our business, if not longer. And I think that there is a higher level of accountability. There's much greater rigor around how we're utilizing our capital and what the negative consequences are of again, poor capital utilization, et cetera. And there's been a great deal of emphasis, rightfully, on the E of ESG. I'm super excited about the emphasis that's now being placed on the S as it relates to it as well. Clearly, I would describe a 9-inning game. I think we're in the bottom of the first, top of the second inning. So there's a lot to do on this front. But long-winded way of saying is that I think that there is we came out with Capital Creates Change. Initially, it was responsible capitalism. And we all have to raise our game as it relates to the role that we play and how we are effectively weaponizing capital for good and ensuring that those who are using it for evil are held to account.
I couldn't agree more on every single point that you've made. And obviously I'm agreeing to everything that you're saying with much less experience, right? Still pretty young and still have a lot to learn. The capital creates change. I remember you telling me about that in our first call. And I thought, oh, well, if Morgan Stanley's done with that campaign, maybe Scholars of Finance can pull that as a headline for a little while, follow in your footsteps.
Keep it going. Keep it going. Absolutely. It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. You need capital. You need capital to scale.
Right. Great work needs to continue to live on. It's interesting. I was wanting to talk about the role that the private sector holds in driving social change, and really how the industry does deploy capital to help grow our communities and improve our communities. I mean, at Scholars of Finance, we oftentimes talk about the thesis, which is when you look at how the world works, you're trying to find the highest leverage way to make change. Governments are largely beholden to capital. You look at FEC versus McCutcheon, FEC versus Citizens United, regulatory capture is increasingly a real thing. And lots of social scientists and political scientists have taught us that in social democracies where the vast majority of the population are overworked, under-resourced, and aren't studying the platforms of different candidates, elections become a popularity contest. And in today's day and age, you win the popularity contest by raising the most money for your campaign. Right. And of course, having your PR team make you likable and making you the perfect celebrity to garner millions and millions of votes. Well, as you mentioned, that capital earlier is not evenly distributed, and any individual or institution now can contribute as much as they'd like to any given candidate. And so when you look at the way the government's structured today and our political and electoral system is structured, you really have to look to capital as sort of the driving force behind it. Michael Porter, in one of my favorite TED Talks, The Case for Letting Businesses Solve Social Problems, Michael Porter explains that 80% of capital in the world is in the private sector. It's in businesses. And I oftentimes talk to my students about how when you examine public companies and increasingly private companies with the proliferation of early stage private capital, angel investment, VC capital, CEOs are employees who report to boards who serve shareholders and investors. Right. And so really that influence seems to lie in the hands of the people who hold capital. And Morgan Stanley is a prime example. There are firms in the world that have hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars of assets under management, right? That they are stewarding, that they are directing, that they are guiding, that they are influencing. And so I think you hit it, on the nail on the head, if you will. I'm curious, you talked about ESG. Let's dive into ESG a little bit. With this growing trend, would love to hear a breakdown of your view on ESG in more detail, right? Really, how are you seeing Morgan Stanley and other companies deploy capital in ways that are creating that social change and improving people's lives?
So before I do that, I just want to go back on a point that you raised, which I just think it's really important. There's obviously public sector, private sector, and you think about some of the greatest challenges that we have, some of the greatest headwinds that we have across our society. And let's just stay here in the U.S. To make it simple. A lot of the issues that we're grappling with, candidly, are issues because of at a different time, different era. But if you go back to the founding of this country, it was the result of both the public and private sector working together to constrain certain communities within our social strata, right? And so we talk about D&I and creating opportunities for folks, and that's been rightfully a big area of focus. And in some ways, right? And I say this to folks all the time when you hear things like, okay, is this affirmative action or reverse racism, et cetera? It's like, in many respects, we are essentially inverting, at least attempting to invert on a much smaller scale, the wrongs, right, that were implemented generation after generation. That was basically the architecture was designed both in through public policy as well as willing private sector participants. And so I say that just as a point because I think it's an important point. Meaning, when if it's the public sector and the private sector that help sort of create some of the messes that we have, by definition, it's got to be the public and private sector that actually gets us to a better place. I know that's a bit provocative, but I think it's an important point that's worth referencing here. And as it relates to ESG specifically, again, I think that we're just in the very beginning of all of this. I mean, you're starting to see whether it's in the asset management community, and this is not, to be very clear, I mean, ESG or SRI, socially responsible investing, which was the acronym before it, it's not a new thing. I mean, this has been around for several decades even, but it's now caught fire, I'd say, over the last, if not 10 years, surely the last 5 years, it's become a real, not phenomenon. I mean, it's now sort of codified into the bones of all financial market participants. And there are some like the BlackRocks of the world who I think are ahead of the pack, but I think everybody is now participating. And a big reason for that is one, that's where capital flows are headed. Two, you think about the demographics of this country, millennials, Gen Z, et cetera, are clearly pushing institutions to be better in this space. And so you start thinking about the stakeholders, employees, investors, et cetera. And so when you really want to see capital start to shift, look at what the stakeholders are ultimately demanding. I think we're starting to see some of that. But again, I think that we're at the vanguard of this, even though we've been talking about it for some time. I think that, let's see where we are in 5 years and 10 years. And I think that, frankly, we won't even be referring to it as ESG because it truly is going to be in the bones of everything that we do. And it's going to have real implications around investment banks like Morgan Stanley, who we actually facilitate capital for. Climate is obviously an easy example. And in what the public sector is doing, the regulatory apparatus is starting to do a much better job of demanding transparency and holding institutions to account. So a lot of words, but in short, to me, it is the thing that will dominate the world of finance for the next couple of decades, easy.
I'm inspired hearing you talk about it. And there's so many things I want to respond to and react to. Just a couple that I'll share. First is that hearing you talk about it, I think the way you talk about being at the beginning, in the bottom of the first inning, at the vanguard, right? Like at the precipice of something great. It's really motivating to hear that. That you really see it as a long-term secular trend. Because I think you hear a lot of the naysayers, kind of, number one, they say, well, it's greenwashing. To that, I say, well, if there are people who are just, jumping on a bandwagon, that's actually better for the world anyways, right? Just because they're not doing it authentically. JC DeSwan, one of our advisors, he's a partner at a hedge fund. They were one of the protagonists in The Big Short, actually. And he teaches the ethics and finance seminar at Princeton. And he wrote a really great book that we recommend to all of our listeners and students called Seeking Virtue in Finance. And he makes this really, really interesting case for like what asset classes, through which asset classes can you have the greatest impact on society? And he argues VC, private equity, and asset or active investing are 1, 2, and 3. And he makes this pretty thoughtful argument about ESG, saying that ESG in the early days, it's not actually making that much impact necessarily on society yet. But when every single player in the market have some set of, whether a shared set of standards or some set of standards of ESG criteria that their investments their companies have to meet, that actually creates downward pressure on cost of capital for businesses that are doing harm to the environment, that aren't helping people, right? That have bad governance. And so what I tell people is maybe there's some greenwashing, but I think most players in the industry are doing it genuinely and really do care. And as soon as all of us are doing it, the better. The sooner everyone does it and it just becomes investing, the better, because then it actually achieves its ultimate end.
Yeah, and the progress is never, particularly progress on this scale is never easy. And so there will always be detractors, and there will always be a subset of what I'll call, market participants or political participants that will be the naysayers and will effectively weaponize, messaging that, causes folks to question, um, the validity of X or Y, or in this particular case, like we've seen the debate around climate change, is it real, is it not, et cetera. And sometimes it takes crises, unfortunately, to get folks to move and to act. So that's always going to be a part of it. But to me, progress here is inevitable. It's that the
Mhm.
machine is way too big. The importance is way too critical. So
Right.
there's always going to be, the naysayers.
Right, right. And we just have to stay positive and optimistic and very rational, very logical, and very open and stay at the table in the process. I think, I hope, and I think the other thing I wanted to react to is the way you frame it, the way you talk about ESG. It really feels like this tidal shift in society that will be permanent. Like as you're talking, I'm literally thinking about the 15th Amendment. I'm thinking about voting rights acts. I'm thinking about the birth of the country, the United States, right? Where there is this large controversial debate discussion. There is a groundswell of support for all of us collectively banding together to do something good that the world needs and that we see very clearly. There are going to be some dissenters, people that don't agree, but we continue to drive forward and press forward and set new precedents and create new norms that last and improve the lives of everyone forever. So I just want to say thank you because I think we talked to a lot of people about ESG, and I think you've put it in terms that feel, I think, like uniquely inspiring and put it in a very long-term systemic perspective, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, the thing that you just articulated, I think, is exactly right. I mean, look, we need stamina, we need will, and we've got to hold that through, in the face of opposition. If you think about how folks talk about wokeism, right, or cancel culture, or whatever it is, right? Like it's so the headwinds will be there, right, and we've got to have stamina to keep moving forward. And again, being the optimist, that's not to say it's going to be a straight line because these things tend to be more circuitous than not. I'm pretty confident that we're going to get to better.
That's fabulous. I'd love to follow this, shifting into another conversation, really about inequality and then about diversity. You did talk about earlier how capital is unevenly distributed. Would love to hear your thoughts on how income inequality has played a role in shaping the world of finance that we know today, and what role you think finance will play in the future of shaping the American workforce and creating opportunity for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of those things that I've got strong views on, and we've got limited time. But I would just tell you, as the country has clearly evolved, and for the better, and that's not to say that we don't have setbacks along the way. And I think about my life and my experiences versus my grandfather, again coming from rural Mississippi, being born in 1924 at the heart of the Jim Crow South. So through that, in that context, things have improved. And I think as relates to as it relates to our laws, if you will, and sort of moving towards a world of greater equality. You mentioned the 15th Amendment or what have you. Clearly, we're in a much better, place as a country. But when you start to talk about equity, right, staying with this theme of capital, and you want to have better distribution of capital, that is a far harder threshold to cross, right? And that is the caloric burn and the will that's going to be required to get to better is going to be much harder, frankly, than it was to even get to a place of equality as just a pure legal matter. And that's not just Mandell, Crawley. I mean, essentially, Dr. King said the exact same thing in the year before he was assassinated. And so it's at the very heart of our issues, right? You start thinking about what capital means, right? At its core, it's about giving you choices. It's about giving you optionality. No one sort of is born. And again, I may be going off track here, partner, but I fundamentally believe we all want the same thing. But the difference is, there's a subset of folks who have far greater optionality than others than others do. And at the end of the day, in the final analysis of all the great work that we're doing, there's a lot of great organizations out there that are committed to pushing, society to better, is capital has to play a role in all of that, because again, as we said earlier, it's the only way that we can actually bring about change at scale. And so when you have the Mandell Crawleys of the world, not to talk in the third person, or any of the other great guests that you've had that are diverse, that maybe a generation or two ago wouldn't have had the opportunities that they've had, while those are great success stories in and of themselves, in order for us to scale that, so that when you're looking at the top of Fortune 500 companies a generation or two from now, you're not talking about a de minimis percentage of folks who were fortunate to get there, but you've got much greater representation, and capital is going to have to play a role there.
Right, right. That I think is a great segue into a conversation about diversity and inclusion in the industry. Would love to hear your perspective, sitting on the operating committee of one of the largest investment banks and financial firms in the world, being a Black man yourself in a leadership role, having gone through what you've gone through, growing up, and some of even the systemic factors that so many people of color, women, have to face day to day and have had to for generations, much worse, of course, in days past. What do you think currently is driving the lack of diversity among firms? Do you think there's still a lack of diversity? How do you think we're pacing on diversity? And in this world where we've pushed so many social issues, especially equity and inclusion, to the forefront of our cultural dialogue, would love to hear your sort of perspective on how we level the playing field in financial services and, for the end customers at large.
Yeah, I mean, look, the data is quite clear. I mean, clearly, we still have a lot of work to do on this front, and I appreciate that we've seen a massive uptick in messaging and intent on the part of the private sector to get to better, and I think that is net positive for sure. And clearly, 2020 was a watershed moment, for not just here in the U.S. but globally, and again on a net basis, I think that again it's been additive, but the data is the data, and you can look at at a gender level, at an ethnicity level. The fact of the matter is we still have too few folks represented at the top of firms and in boardrooms or in key executive roles across literally every sector, right? So there's only one or two explanations for that. Either the talent, right, from these communities aren't good enough, right, or it's a reflection of the structural oppression and the structural limitations that have existed since the beginning. And we, of course, know that it's the latter of the two. And so I'm under no false illusions that this is something that's going to be solved in a year or two or 10. Right? If it's taken, centuries in the making to get to this particular point where folks truly didn't have the opportunity to get educated or didn't have the opportunity to work in this industry or that industry, et cetera, it is going to take us time. And so the thing that I'm most proud of, and I'll just speak for my firm, is while the inconvenient truth of the math problem, right, will exist for some time, there are steps that we can take to ensure that every employee that walks the halls of Morgan Stanley can feel like they belong there. That's something that you can actually solve for much sooner. And that's part of what you are and your leadership team are passing on to the participants of your great organization in terms of just moral leadership and having this, having a higher degree of an emotional intelligence with who you work with, who your partners are, being a great partner. So it's not just about how you treat customers, how you treat your colleagues, or what have you, and everything else that comes with the standards that you guys are implementing. But at Morgan Stanley, I mean, that's something that we have been, incredibly deliberate around, is making sure that everybody feels that they can bring their authentic self. We're not perfect. There's no finish line around this work, and candidly, this is not something that's unique to Morgan Stanley. I know that there's a lot of institutions that are really focused on getting this to a better place. And what do we have to do? It's all of the above, right? There's a number of levers, right, that you have to pull to grow the pie. And that's the one thing that I'd love to see the finance community continue to focus on. Is it's not about how can Morgan Stanley take the Black or Hispanic or women talent out of Goldman Sachs. That doesn't solve the problem. We need to grow the pie, and so we need the talented folks that are part of organizations like Scholars of Finance to join the fight, right? And as we grow that population, right, and as they are successful, that's how you get this multiplier effect. And candidly, that's going to happen.
Thanks for sharing, and I appreciate the I wouldn't say the optimistic view. I'd call it. It sounds like a pragmatic, optimistic view. To all of our listeners, I will say, we're excited to announce soon that Morgan Stanley is becoming a founding partner of Scholars of Finance. So to any of our students listening, would highly encourage you to apply to Morgan Stanley, and there'll be a lot on the front. There'll be a lot in the future on that. We're super thrilled about the partnership that's coming here in 2022. But I think what you just said segues into my final question, and then I want to do a couple rapid fire questions for you as we wrap up on time. You're coming up on 30 years at Morgan Stanley. You've moved across multiple divisions of the firm. What changes have you seen in the office over the last 30 years in terms of diversity? And if we look at the situation as pragmatic optimists, can you expand a little bit more on what the future of finance looks like for underrepresented communities as that pie grows?
Yeah, so we've evolved. If you think about Morgan Stanley is an 86-year-old institution, and for the first 50 years, it was a private partnership. And if you look at what that partnership looked like, no one in that photo looked like me. So that's circa 1986 is when Morgan Stanley went public. Fast forward to today, we've got much greater representation. Obviously, off of a very low bar. It was a very low bar to clear, but we're a much more diverse firm. In fact, a third of our employees, we have 76,000 employees, are ethnically diverse, right? So we are progressing along the path. It never feels like it's moving fast enough, but we are absolutely moving in the right direction. And again, I think about just the demographic more broadly, and even our majority colleagues who are millennial, Gen Z, et cetera. I mean, just a far more progressive perspective, right, that I think will turbocharge, our efforts because they are demanding. That's the thing that's really important here, is that it's not just Black and brown folks that are saying we need greater representation. It's true, call them allies, if you will, but true partners who are saying that, no, I want to work for a firm that embraces these things. So I am optimistic for that reason, and that's been my experience as I've grown in my career at Morgan Stanley. And frankly, being on the firm's operating committee, I mean, that obviously that brings with it a level of responsibility that I have to do my part, which I gladly step into that. But we've got other folks on the OpCo who are diverse, and again, doing a great job of being ambassadors and representative of the firm that we aspire to be. But ultimately, as my goal is to find, the talent that's going to basically go much further than I've gone inside the walls. Not that I'm done yet, but go much further than what I've been able to do. And that's how this thing is supposed to work. I met with a mentor of mine a couple of weeks ago for lunch who ran investment banking at a competitive firm, and he's been a key champion for me personally. And he genuinely roots for me. He roots for me to get to even higher level than where he got. And that's how this thing is ultimately supposed to work. I'm sorry for going on too long there, partner.
I don't think you went on too long at all. Can I hit you with 3 rapid fire questions?
Of course.
All right. Real quick, right at the top of your head, whatever comes to mind, 1 or 2 of the most influential books you've ever read that our audience might enjoy or might benefit from reading.
Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, in just terms of just mental toughness, is one. The other is Essentialism by Greg McEwen, doing the disciplined pursuit of less. Those are 2 books that immediately comes to mind. Atomic Habits by James Clear is another one that I think would be a great read. I know I cheated there a little bit.
No, we got more than we bargained for. This is great. All right, three great book recommendations. Next rapid fire question. Key advice you'd offer for young people entering the industry, trying to enter the industry, who want to follow in your footsteps, especially for our students from underrepresented backgrounds. How can these young people get in the door and succeed early on in their careers?
Yeah, I think number one, you'll be appropriately edgy in managing your career. No one's ever going to care about your career as much as you do. And then I'd say you need three things. One is a high degree of self-confidence. And that's not cockiness, but that's confidence, being really prepared and just appreciating who you are and what you bring to the table. So high degree of self-confidence. Two, embrace the insecurity. We all have it, right? We don't project it. You never see that on anyone's social media feed. You never see anybody talking about their insecurities on Instagram, but we all have it, right? Embrace it. It's part of the process, right? You know, the J curve, as I like to call it. You step into a new job, a new role. You feel like you're going backwards before you actually, sort of stabilize and start to add value, or whatever. So embrace the insecurity. And then third, which is critical, impulse control. Be very thoughtful and planful in your decision making. Try to be as less emotional as you can. So high degree of self-confidence, embrace insecurity, and impulse control.
Excellent advice. I don't know if I shared this with you before, but in high school, I was pursuing a career as a professional boxer. So I appreciate your poster even more so. But I will say, now I tell my students that was the manifestation of a young man trying to cover up a lot of insecurities, trying to act confident because he was insecure. There are better ways than getting your face bashed in. So glad my parents talked me out of that one when I was a kid. Last rapid fire question for you. You're incredibly busy. You're on the operating committee of Morgan Stanley, and you've been so generous with your time at Scholars of Finance. You know, our mutual friend, one of our advisors, Scott Harrison, connected us initially. Another one of our mutual friends, Troy Greep, over at Morgan Stanley, you know, strongly recommended that we connect as well. Peter Aquaboa, one of your teammates, you know, has really been helping drive a relationship at Morgan Stanley, along with you. You and I have connected. We've had a number of phone calls. You've been generous with your time, your wisdom, your advice, your encouragement. And even on this call, you've spoken so highly about Scholars of Finance. I would love to know, you know, in that early introduction, what stood out to you about SOF's vision and mission, and why do you root for Scholars of Finance? Why are you rooting for us?
Well, first, like most, organizations, you always start with the when you're thinking about investing, you start with the founder CEO, right? Because that sets the tone. And obviously, I'll embarrass you here a little bit, but spending time with you and who you are and your reputation and getting to know you, you have not disappointed. So in many ways, you set the tone. There's a lot of things that you could be doing given your talents and the fact that you're choosing to do this. Again, following your heart. Clearly, your heart was dislocated to the point where you decided to lean into this and make this your life's work. So that resonates with me. So that's one. Two, last I checked, Morgan Stanley is an active participant in the talent marketplace. And the talent that's being cultivated here, right, is a pipeline, right, for firms like mine. So away from my own personal passion and interest, just as a commercial matter, candidly, being proximate to organizations that are being intentional about talking about how important moral leadership is, how important integrity is, how important responsible capitalism is, and these are virtues that we hold dear at my firm. And that's not to say that we don't have the bad actor or two from time to time. Again, it's a big 76,000 people, 39 countries. Bad things happen, but the opportunity to get close to talent that is immersed in these teachings and these principles, how could that not resonate? And then, of course, there's a D&I, element to this as well. Again, so it's not just world-class talent, but it's also diverse talent. And again, going back to the things that we're trying to do at my firm, this is obviously an addressable audience that that's very attractive to us as well. So I root for you for those reasons, and I can say that you set the tone.
Thanks, Mandell. You were right. I do feel a little bit embarrassed, but I'll take the compliment. I'm very grateful. That means a lot coming from you. So humbled by that. And all of us as scholars of finance are incredibly grateful for your leadership, your mentorship, your support, and for all of the work that the firm is doing and will continue to grow in doing with us over the next several years. So I know we're at time. Just want to say thank you so much for your time today. Hope you have an amazing rest of your weekend. Hope to have you on the podcast again soon.
Yeah, I'd love to do it. And I leave you, the group, with my favorite quote. No, two quotes. One is light yourself on fire with enthusiasm. And Ross, you embody this. Light yourself on fire with enthusiasm. People will come from miles and miles away to watch you burn. So that's one. And then two is the dream is free, but the hustle is sold separately, right? The dream is free, the hustle is sold separately. And I think that that's true. We got a lot of dreamers. I'm sure that's a part of this organization.
Yeah.
In the final analysis, to get to where you want to go, you're going to have to grind. And I know everybody gets that. So thanks for having me, partner. I really enjoyed this. And blessings to you, your fiance, and your family.
Thanks, Mandel. Grateful for your time.
All right, buddy. You got it.